Hello, welcome to Mr. Gill's Science Stuff. This is episode 3 of Conservation Conversations. Today we're coming back home to the UK and looking at Europe as well, particularly Romania and Transylvania. Now this is a bit different, not only because it is so close to home, but also because I have still never met this man in real life. This is the only conversation I've had with him, and what a guy, what a first conversation to have. He's a mutual contact of mine through Operation Wallacea, who is thanked for the introduction, and particularly Tim Coles of Oxford and Opwall. And he is coming at this from a different angle to the other speakers in that he is not an out-and-out conservationist. He is a farmer, and he bridges that gap brilliantly between farming and conservation, which is something you need to do for your A-level. Now, often we kind of ignore the farming side of this conflict, looking more in education at people who are purely conservationists. And this seems a little bit wrong to me because sure, there's conflict between agriculture and farming, but as far as custodians of the land go, people who actually know the land on which they live and work, the farmers are an absolute repository of incredible information, and they're often ignored. Now, I'm country born and raised myself, and I often take the link between the food we eat and where it came from for granted. And it's through teaching that I've realised how disconnected a lot of the population actually are. So this conversation was absolutely incredible in terms of talking about some stuff that's really quite close to my heart as well. Now, again, this was about an hour and 20 minutes of pure gold in terms of useful biology. So I have had to cut it down and put a bonus material video together. So if you want to know about dung beetles, teat hygiene in the dairy industry, veganism, imported food versus getting meat from nearby, and the emerging meat consumption habits of China, then that's something for you to watch. Highly recommend it. And I'm going to apologise now for some slight technical issues we had, so it might look a little bit different to previous episodes. I found this so engaging that I didn't notice some of the technical issues going on my end, but I think I've managed to iron out most of the problems, but it's because the beginning was a little bit laggy. We join Nat Page at the point where he's introducing himself and giving a little bit of detail about who he is and what it is he does.
My name's Nat Page, and I'm a beef farmer in the west of England near Shaftesbury. But I've got a rather unusual background because I studied biology at school and did a degree in zoology. And then I joined the Foreign Office for 14 years. So I got that in my background. But after that, in 1995, I came back to farming because I've always loved nature and farming were my thing. So I've been a beef farmer for 25 years. And then my last posting as a diplomat was Romania.
Okay.
And I loved the Romanian countryside. And so soon after I started farming here, I established an NGO with some friends in Romania, a charity, non-government organization, with a number of dedicated young Romanians living in Transylvania. Transylvania is basically the area within the Carpathians, north of the Carpathians, which form a kind of a horseshoe shape in the middle of Romania.
Right.
Transylvania is an area of plateau, rolling hills, and it's got a very special landscape. So for the last 20 years, I've been balancing my life between farming here in the UK and running an NGO which basically works as a farm advisory service in Transylvania.
Okay.
And that is specifically aimed at maintaining the traditional management systems that we find out there.
Brilliant. I mean, that's sort of led on to the next question perfectly, which is why is it that you found Romania so compelling? What is it about the environment in Romania that's so valuable? You mentioned on your website talking about high value farmed landscapes.
Yeah.
What is it that you mean by that?
Yes. High nature value was an idea promoted about 20 years ago, and it became part of EU policy. Okay. And the idea is that you you try to work out why landscapes are high nature value. And this is aimed at farmed landscapes. So people talk about HNV farmed landscapes. There are different types of HNV farmed landscape, which you have something called a category 1, which is basically a climax grassland area that may be grazed by sheep, but otherwise is untouched by humans. Then you've got a type 2, which is a mosaic landscape with hay meadows, little bits of arable, and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And then type 3, which is arable with, but which also has good, particularly bird species.
Right.
And oddly enough, in the EU, it was a duty of all member states to maintain HNV farmed landscapes. They had a duty to map, estimate the area and maintain them. But unfortunately that was given up because nobody could define exactly, could agree on a definition of HNV, and therefore this rule became unenforceable. But basically, around Saskies is a very good example of high nature value farmed landscape. It's one of the biggest protected farmland natural areas in Europe under the European Habitats Directive, this system of areas they call Natura 2000 sites. It's one of the biggest in Europe. Some people call it a medieval landscape, but actually it's like England would have been before the Second World War, really. You don't have to go back that far to see a similar system working in England.
So it's a lovely little time capsule, or it's a lovely little time capsule of what we used to have in the UK.
Exactly, yeah. And the extraordinary thing is that in this area, it's a balance of forest, pasture, which you've grazed, where you graze animals, meadow, mown meadows for hay, and little bits of arable. And in there, you can make a list of European protected habitats. There are about 16 protected habitats, grassland, scrub, wetland, forest. For any one of those in Western Europe, people would get very excited and protected. There are 16 of these habitats, all crammed together and coexisting. They are a dynamic mosaic where lots of things are coexisting, which on paper you might think shouldn't be in the same area, but because it's so dynamic, they can all coexist. And in this area, we've got 40 small villages, and in each of those small villages, there are probably 200, 250 families. 90% of them are still working directly in agriculture.
Okay.
So the link between agriculture and man is incredibly strong, and looked at from the village point of view, the participation of people, and also the way the land is managed. Yeah. It's a treasure trove. As you said, it's a time capsule, but it's also a haven of species that have died out in Western Europe that could be used gradually to repopulate Western Europe. A bit like we've seen wolves coming over from Eastern Europe to West, but I'm hoping that many more species will come over from Eastern Europe to the West, just as we make the habitats in Western Europe more acceptable to them.
The next point is about that sort of balance and conflict, because the way that it's phrased, certainly for our syllabus and for our students, is that biodiversity and food production and agriculture are often in opposition. In your experience, where have you seen conflicts arise between agriculture, food production, and have you seen any particularly good examples, either from Romania or the UK, where conservation and agriculture have worked well together? I mean, is it always antagonistic, or can they work well side by side?
Yeah. There is a famous curve produced by an organization called European Environment Agency in Copenhagen. And they've shown that biodiversity measured by species and habitats found in a certain area actually goes up slightly as human intervention begins, and then it goes massively down as
Okay.
human intervention becomes more intensive. So to give an example, a hay meadow is very diverse, floristically diverse.
Mm.
Especially in Transylvania, they're not seeded, they're full of natural, spontaneous herbs and flowers. If you stop mowing that hay meadow, biodiversity goes down. So there's
Yes.
one example of where agriculture and biodiversity are not conflicting, they're actually supporting each other.
What you're talking about there is management of succession, isn't it? It's management of successional processes, which again is also part of our curriculum.
Yes, yes, and you might get the natural succession in Transylvania is grassland to hornbeam. Hornbeam is the dominant tree, so
Right.
you'll get gradual scrubbing up and then afforestation.
Yeah.
And one might argue that the ideal climax habitat for the whole of Transylvania is hornbeam forest, but actually that doesn't have very high biodiversity within it. So to prevent the afforestation, you're stopping the succession process at a point where it's particularly high biodiversity.
So that's fascinating that the intervention of people in the first instance to a level actually increases biodiversity, which is so before we were there, we were saying that the biodiversity was actually lower, and actually humans in the first instance by farming practices aided biodiversity.
Yes, exactly.
It's not usually the way you would think about it, certainly from the point of view of
and they farm in a mosaic. The farmers have very small patches of land. One year they'll mow their bit of hay meadow in June, and the next year they'll mow another bit. They'll mow that bit 2 or 3 weeks later.
Yeah.
The management of that land is a patchwork, and nature, biodiversity loves heterogeneity. They don't want things done all at the same time. And that's one thing I've learned as well, the dynamic nature of species and habitats. You don't have to impose a specific management plan the same time every year to protect a species. What you need is a lot of change, and it stimulates things. So you've got this, the mosaic is in space and time. So 1 year, if you look at one parcel, the time it's mowed or possibly ploughed up changes from year to year. And it's mosaic in space because these are very small patches, and the patch next door will be mowed at a different time as well.
Yeah.
And also ecotones.
Okay.
So barriers between habitats are known as ecotones, and they are shown to be incredibly high in biodiversity, because you can imagine that a species might be preying on another species, or the interaction in these barriers between habitats is very stimulating for species diversity. So that's another thing that happens. But looking at, what's the question about positive and negative?
Yes.
Yes, because looking at it more from in Transylvania, you're looking at one particular situation where you've got a management that is going on that is very nature friendly, and the best way to maintain that biodiversity is to maintain the small-scale farming system. So it's a very difficult, very different problem from what you have in Western Europe. In Western Europe, you've got largely damaged agricultural landscapes, and you have to think of ways to bring biodiversity back. And I think the biggest problems there are soil loss. Farmers are unbelievably uncaring about the loss of soil, and they will often plough in areas where soil is washed into rivers, or they will spray the soil and reduce the organic carbon content of the soil. So the loss of soil quality is one of the worst things. There are various ways we can try and show farmers that it's not economically a good idea for them to do it, as well as from the point of view of
Yeah,
good good care for the soil.
because presumably
And then,
it's
yeah,
short-termism. It's presumably it's not a
exactly.
sustainable long-term way to do things. I mean, we talk about monoculture and
Yeah,
how it leads to lack of sustainable, soil quality over time.
yeah,
Presumably that's the direction you'd go down in those conversations.
yes, exactly. That make they might spend less and make a
Yeah.
slightly higher profit in year one, but the economic consequences are going to come and bite them
Mm.
fairly quickly, because they'll have to put on more fertilizers, and actually the ground will respond less and less to those
Yeah.
fertilizers because the soil itself is a less good medium for growing roots in.
Well, then, in that
Uh,
case,
yeah,
should we have should we do the question on chemicals, because specifically the nitrogen cycle and nitrogen enrichment and fixation are things that we have to study, our students have to know about. What have you seen, again? You sort of alluded to it there, in the differences between Romania and the UK in terms of their uses of pesticides and fertilizers, and is there anything to sort of merge two questions that you would bring from Romania to the UK, or Romania or UK to Romania?
uh, it's it's very interesting. Romania's been largely protected by the very small scale land ownership.
Yeah.
Farms are often only 3 or 4 acres in size. So nobody can buy equipment. They can't really afford to buy sprays either and that kind of thing for those very small areas. So it's been
Yes.
protected by the small land areas and by the fact that unfortunately farmers don't have that much disposable income as well.
Yeah.
But that's prevented them from doing this. So that won't last forever. And we are very keen in our work in Romania to try and find solutions to these problems now before these landscapes are lost,
Yes.
because farms will become bigger and richer. And the other
Fantastic.
thing about grass that I've discovered as an organic farmer is there are certain weeds that farmers will always go and spray,
Yes.
docks and thistles. The trouble
Right.
is they also kill legumes. They don't kill grasses, but they will kill
Okay.
clovers, which are very important for your soil. But
Because of the nitrogen fixation and the root nodules, the rhizobium bacteria.
exactly, they contribute an awful lot, and they mean that you don't need to chuck on so much bag nitrogen fertilizer. And also they feed pollinators as well. The
Yes.
clover flowers are very good for pollinators. But if you're spraying for docks or thistles, you will kill those, and you'll have a pretty much inert, biologically inert pasture full of ryegrass and maybe a couple of other species. But I found, just from experience of being an organic farmer, for 20 years I've been just cutting with a flail topper my docks and thistles, and they disappeared as quickly as if I'd sprayed them. And so good
Okay.
mechanical management can reduce the pesticides you put on.
While protecting the legumes, presumably, and therefore protecting the
Ex-
soil quality. And
exactly,
yeah.
exactly. And so looking again at conventional farming in the UK and how we can change it, the big argument I use to the farmers is you can increase your profits in 2 ways. You can make more, increase your outputs,
Yeah.
or you can keep your outputs about the same, but you have fewer input costs. You spend you spend less on fertilizers, diesel for trogging around your
Yeah.
fields and putting these horrible things on your farms, other things, fertilizers, pesticides, farm equipment, they can all be reduced, and you can make higher profits by spending less on inputs and not putting your farm under a massive stress. And that's a very important argument for farmers.
Yeah.
And it's also been proved as well. If you have field margins, wildflower field margins, people have done research on the amount of pesticide you can save on because of the field margins.
Yes.
Because they don't only support pollinators, but they support pest predators, things like
Yes.
wasps that
Yeah.
go around. And the Germans have done a study actually measuring the number of kilograms of aphids that a wasp will catch and eat in a day. And if you add that up by multiplying it with 1,000 wasps in 365 days, whatever, you're actually
Huge amount
saving
of
yourself. Yeah, that's right.
Mm.
So I think although it's easy to be pessimistic about Western agriculture, I think farmers are beginning to think more about these things
Yes.
than they did before. And a lot of those ways of thinking 10 years ago, people would have been laughed at, and now it's entered the mainstream thinking.
I mean, so of course, in your system of organic farming, you don't put any nitrate fertilizer, presumably any artificial nitrate fertilizer, onto the soil at all.
Yes.
I mean, do you muck spread? Do you use the cattle the cattle waste products to enrich the soil in any way, or?
Yes.
Yes.
You can have two kinds of system really. Dairy farmers often have a slurry system where you get this awful liquid muck
Yes.
from the cows. We don't have that. We have a straw-based system. So they live on straw, and we put a bit more straw on top every couple of days to keep it clean. And then that straw is piled up, kept for 6 months, and then spread on the land with muck spreaders. That's a very good way of maintaining the fertility as well. Particularly, we do that on fields we have grazed, because on fields we have cut for silage, or made hay or silage on, because if you're cutting for silage, you're just taking away carbon, whatever, from that area. But if fields are grazed, the cows are naturally, coming back to cow pats again, the cows are naturally re-fertilizing the fields that they're eating the grass from. So you don't need to spread muck on the pasture, you need to spread it on the cut fields.
Fantastic.
As a tiny thing to mention, I cover my muck heap, because a lot of people don't cover their muck heaps, and then all the goodness, the high nitrogen, lovely dark fluids are washed out, and they go into a single area under the muck heap.
Right.
And also you get a certain amount of evaporation of some greenhouse gases as well from muck heaps. So I always cover my muck heap with plastic, and I would say that most farmers don't bother to do that, and therefore they are not getting the benefit they should be from their muck heaps. And also, covering the muck heap encourages it to ferment inside and compost inside as well.
That's a fantastic example of the biochemistry that we're asked to teach to our students, in terms of they have to know that denitrifying bacteria are anaerobes and that kind of stuff, and they remove nitrogen from things like muck heaps into the atmosphere. And obviously by something as simple as covering the muck heap, you're keeping more of the nitrogen in there to be used as a fertilizer. So that's a fantastic example of applied biochemistry using a pile of muck in a plastic sheet.
Good Lord, I didn't think of it as applied biochemistry.
Well, I mean, that's exactly how I think that it fits in beautifully with what we have to do. So you give us a very good example there of talking about UK chemical inputs. Now, presumably, you'd see very similar low chemical inputs, low fertilizer and pesticide inputs in Romanian systems.
Yes.
But you mentioned a moment ago that while you're raising their wealth and their productivity, the reason they're not doing that is because they can't afford to buy them. So how exactly do you manage to sort of skip them through the stage that we've had in the UK since the Second World War? How do you go from their sort of mosaic, fairly old-fashioned, if you like, system to the modern view that actually they've been doing it right all along? How do you skip the middle bit, basically?
Yes, the economic argument is always the most important, because some conservation organizations, I should say that our organization is called Fundația Adapt. We regard ourselves as a bridge between conservationists and farmers. And some conservation organizations go in and say, oh no, you can't do that, it's bad for nature. And the farmers say, you just want to keep us living primitively for you guys to come and admire the countryside. And we're not prepared to, this isn't the deal we want.
Fair enough, yeah.
Yeah, we want to be able to send our children to school and give them proper clothes and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so we are working very much on the financial argument, but we have managed to double or triple the income of these farmers.
Wow.
And one way is, a lot of it is milk. They produce milk, and we've worked with the farmers to improve the hygiene of the milk.
I mean, that sort of leads us to the next one. I mean, do you go in for measuring these impacts in terms of sort of ecosystem services, to use the terminology? And our students have to know a lot about measurements and actually how data is gathered. So when you're looking into impacts and looking into biodiversity, can you talk us through some of the survey and data collection that perhaps goes on in Romania, and where that data ends up? Where does it go? More the science end of things.
Yeah. We've had 8 years now of Operation Wallacea coming to do monitoring, and that makes us a unique protected area in Romania. Nobody else has this kind of information, annual information coming in over 8 years, and that's very important to show trends in what is happening. The most interesting thing they do is repeated transects. So they will do a certain line several times every summer, and measure or record the butterflies they see in a sort of meter square or 2 meter square box they're walking through. They'll be recording the flowers they see as well, and they'll do also transects for bird watching, for which mainly they're using a mixture of visual and bird calls to identify the birds. And it's very good data because it's managed by university professors or senior teachers who go over there, so that the students who go over, they're doing something useful, but also their data is checked as it goes along as well. Using those kind of data, you can then go to policymakers and say, we think you've got to do this to improve land management.
That's a fantastic example, again, of the application of the techniques that our students have to know. I mean, we learn about transects. I mean, you've described there a belt transect looking at butterflies, an interrupted belt transect for the birds, which is exactly the techniques they're learning, although for us it's generally go across a school field and count the daisies, which isn't quite so interesting or applied as what you're talking about.
Tell them to come out to Transylvania then.
Well, I'm sure they would love to do that when we can do that. I'm sure they would very much enjoy to see it in the real world, which is really the reason for these conversations. So I think you've pretty much answered. I think the answer to the next one is going to be, again, economic. But I've put here is a question I'm asking to every speaker, which is, in your experience, what do you think is the root of why people damage their own environment? Because if you live in an environment, you don't want to damage it generally, in my experience. So why, in your experience, do you think it is that people do just damage their environments?
Yes, it's economic in one way, but I think, although it's a strong word, ignorance.
Right.
They don't know the results. They don't appreciate the results of their actions. Okay. And that's why ADEPT have been very keen in Romania at going around and explaining the links between healthy soil, healthy plants, and healthy cattle, and a higher price for their milk, that kind of thing. So it is economic, but it also, if farmers were, in a non-confrontational way, were helped to understand how they can benefit economically from better management of the land, then I think that's it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes perfectly to the next point, which is in terms of the most successful forms. Would you say that education, that sort of education of the economic benefits, is possibly the most powerful form of conservation that you've seen, or is there another more powerful form of conservation that you can name? And is it different in the UK and Romania, or is this ignorance of the damage that's being caused just as prevalent here as it is in Romania?
I would say it is as prevalent. It's not just the farmers. At least in Romania, everybody is still linked to the land in one way or another. I'm just beginning to work with various apps to record biodiversity and soil quality.
Yeah.
And I think that as well as advisory work, somebody might come to your farm and say, well, if you did this or that, or come to a workshop on dung beetles, and they'll come and they'll be half asleep. But if they are actively involved in measuring what's happening on their farm, a surprising number of farmers are really interested. I have an enormous, great boxer of a contractor who comes on his tractor several times a year to do various jobs. And when I started talking to him about farm birds, he didn't say, I haven't got time for that. He said, wow, I'm really interested by that. I see them often from my cab and I'd love to know more about them. And so it's not only training, but it's encouraging active participation. And I think high tech is a very important way of doing that, using apps. Most farmers in Romania might not to be able to buy many luxuries, but one of the first things they buy is a smartphone.
Of course,
and once you've got a smartphone, you as a farmer can become directly involved in much more easily in doing these transects themselves. And I think they respond very well to that as well.
Fantastic. That's a good insight. I mean, that's something I've noticed as well, and the various sites I've visited is the prevalence of smartphones. And then that sort of thing. So let's say this all works very nicely, and you get some people really engaged and really keen to take a farm that has been intensively managed back to either something like your farm in the UK or one of the farms in Transylvania. How long do you think it takes to restore good soil quality, a good balance in a European setting? How long does that take, and is it practical? I mean, this is basically a succession question.
Yes.
The part of the syllabus we need to address.
Just to compare it with Romania, they very often plough up little areas of Romania, but those are surrounded by very rich wildflower sites, and the seed rain from those, and a certain amount of the seed bank that's been left in the soil already, means that in an extraordinary short time, in 2 or 3 years, you wouldn't know it had been ploughed, and in 8 years, it will be back to what it was. It'll be back to how the surrounding hay meadow looks, and that's in Romania, where you've got a very rich, supportive environment in which these ploughings up happen or whatever.
Yeah.
In England, the soil, I won't even talk about it, could take a very long time. When you do intensive use of soil, the soil organic carbon goes down from 12 to 18% in organic soil down to 2 or 3%.
Right.
And it takes many, many years to restore that. And it becomes almost a kind of inert clay that you're growing stuff in. I would say that it's a 10-year job to get it back.
Right.
But you can have some, you can see some things after a few years, but it's a long job. But it's not heartbreaking, because you can see things gradually coming. After 2 or 3 years, you'll see things coming back, and then it'll get better and better.
I suppose that's quite a hard sell, isn't it? That's quite a hard sell to the farmer to say that to go back to this other system, you're going to have a number of years where you aren't making any money off that land.
I mean, you'll still be able to use it, but you'll see a dip in production before you get the growth in production again. Yes, exactly. So it is a hard sell.
So I think that gets on to the next one. I mean, the next point, which is in terms of the UK. I mean, you mentioned in Romania, the sort of 90% of people in these villages are involved in food production in some way. Realistically, I don't think that's going to happen in the UK anytime soon. We're not going to get 90% of people producing their own food, as much as it might be nice to get them to do so. So in terms of the UK, I suppose particularly, what do you think the best way is to balance the needs of food production and, because people obviously need to eat, don't they? And the population is not going anywhere, and the needs of conservation. If everybody farmed the way you farmed, would there be enough food for the UK population?
Yes, yeah, exactly. That's the prime question. And I think people ideally should get used to eating less meat but better meat. And
couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and I think if we can link the consumer with the farmer a bit closer, and maybe COVID will help us to do it, more and more, most people will go to a supermarket and buy what's cheapest because they think that's best for their family, and they think if they buy organic meat at twice the price, they've probably got to make economies in other ways. It's a very hard thing to sell. Mm-hmm. Ideally, we should create stronger links between the consumers and the producers. In the PFLA, for example, we have QR codes on our meat that you can put your smartphone by, and it'll bring up a whole web page on the farm and even on the animal you're eating. And that helps to create that link. So because most of the population in England is in the city, it's very hard for them to go and buy direct from the farmer. But if possible, consumers should become much more interested in where their food comes from, and
definitely
be willing to pay a bit more for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the comparators to other countries in terms of our percentage of our income, what we actually spend on food, is very, very, very low, isn't it? And compared to other countries, we have very, very cheap food because the supermarket pressure on farmers, and so on and so forth. So can I, on that sort of global note, can I slot my extra question in here I mentioned before we started, which isn't strictly related to the A level, but in the last week or two, we've had various agriculture bills going through the Houses of Parliament, and the current government, Boris Johnson's government, has sort of put through a bill that doesn't maintain some of his promises to stop the import of American meat produce and all that kind of stuff, which obviously has grown to a different standard, which he did say he was going to not do that, and they have done that. So as a beef farmer, what do you think it is that is actually different about American imports particularly, and are you concerned about chlorinated chicken and all of the rest of it?
The agriculture bill has failed, and it does worry me. Yeah, I think they have allowed themselves to, perhaps as a balance, they feel that they can't antagonize the USA as well as the EU at the same time, and they've got to make these concessions. I have read certain comments from the political analysts that say that an outright ban of chlorinated chicken may not be happening, but they are going to put increased tariffs. So on both chlorinated chicken and hormone beef and other things that aren't grown to our standards. So although they're not banning them, they're going to put increased tariffs on their import, which will make it more expensive in our shops and less attractive for people to import, which is a sort of compromise, and we'll have to watch and see if that happens. But I think there is a big danger to beef farmers, sheep farmers, particularly, the threat of cheap imports as a result of coming out of Europe. I and many farmers in my area voted to leave Europe because we wanted, farmers are very independent people and they don't want to be told what to do by other people. But we may find that there are some bad consequences we hadn't anticipated, and that's one of them. It could really be a big danger to livestock farming in the UK.
That's fascinating, because you often hear reported secondhand what farmers are saying, and obviously, it's great to have it from the horse's mouth, as it were. So we're getting towards the end here. So next question is, I think you've probably covered most of this, but if there's one thing you could change to change the way we interact with our food, or improve the way we produce our food, and you had the power to change one thing, what would it be?
I was talking a couple of years ago to Patrick Holden, who is the head of the Soil. He was then the head of the Soil Association, which is the biggest certifier of organic farmers. And he said there would be no need for a Soil Association or any kind of certification if the public bought their food directly from the farmer and knew the farm of the farmer. And then the public would vote with their feet about who they bought their food from. So I think the biggest thing I would do is well, it's a sort of multiple answer, I'm afraid, but
it's fine.
Try to protect smaller scale farmers, because small scale family farms who are going to hand on to the next generation have a much longer term view of their farm health than companies who want a short term return. And how do you protect small scale farmers? You have to bring them together to teach them to market their food and make it higher quality, and then acclimatize the consumer to buying that higher quality food that they value more because it's got a story behind it. And the more we can create that link, as I mentioned, the QR code with the bit of beef, but the more we can create that link between the consumer and the producer, the more the consumer will value the food, because a lot of it is wasted as well, of course. We all know that over a third of food is wasted. So if people spend more, they might waste less. But the more we can strengthen that link between the consumer and the producer, they will support each other in creating high quality food. And I think that's got to be done by some very clever marketing systems that create associations, create local benefits and local groups for the producers, and then feed through to some very nice high-tech, maybe marketing that will create a seamless chain and as short as possible between the producer and the consumer.
Absolutely right. I think we can all agree with that. So you've kind of answered that. What is the final point? What would you encourage my students to do with regards to the way they consume and interact with food? And so finally, are there any other messages or pieces of advice you would have for a group of A-level students who are going to be going off into the world, who've chosen to do biology, and what would you like them to know and take with them?
Wow. Nature is amazing, because if you give it a chance, it'll come back. And that's what's fun, is that nature doesn't always need man's intervention to survive. You just need to give it a chance. And the more we understand about it, the more we realize that just creating space for nature, you can then sit back and watch this miracle happening. And when I take my visitors to Romania, I take them to the top of the hill and look at this mosaic landscape and say, the best thing we can do to protect nature, biodiversity in this area, is to keep this farming system going. And a lot of them are pure conservationists, and they feel this is rather a strange answer. But that comes back to, isn't evolution amazing? I was lucky enough to study zoology under Richard Dawkins, which is pretty amazing, at New College, Oxford. So I'm very lucky to have had that experience. But isn't neo-Darwinism is such an amazing tool for creating complex organisms? And we're only just one of them. And if we can give space to the rest, they'll do the work. We don't need to intervene too much. Nature will fill that space.
Wow, what a conversation. So an incredible message to leave us on there, because really what could be more important than the food that we eat? So there's absolutely tons in there, both on the syllabus and not. So do watch the bonus video for all the extra material that we didn't have time to fit in there. It's well worth it, especially if you don't know what hay rattle is, for example. Next up, we're off to the Ecuadorian cloud forests for something more exotic. I'll see you then.